Hi everyone, this is Chaudhary, Psychotherapist, and today we're going to be talking about the differences between sibling estrangement and parental estrangement. Now, sibling estrangement has often been the subject of our podcast, and yet there are other types of estrangements that can be just as painful, if not more. And one such experience is parental estrangement, which can leave important scars on a person and affect not only their developmental upbringing, but also the future choices they make. And here we'll explore some of the similarities and differences, as well as what's needed for both of these types of estrangement. So, Fern, it's wonderful to have you here. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Allie John. It's so interesting that we're talking about this today because just yesterday I read a profile in the New York Times that mentioned that presidential candidate Kamala Harris is estranged from her father. And this resulted decades ago as part of a divorce, I suspect, as there was a bitter custody battle and then a lot of fallout from that. But the reason I mention it to you is sibling estrangement is becoming more and more evident in as many people talk about it, and parental alienation has gotten even more attention recently, and partly because of public figures expressing some of this as well, that they are struggling with this issue.
Absolutely. And I think that's an important point you're making because we're starting to hear more and more about people that are in the limelight, celebrities, politicians, etc. All sorts of people that are in positions where we get to, of course, publicly see them that are experiencing these same type of problems that people have in our community, especially, right? And I think it's good for us to talk about that because there's a lot of similarities, right? And I'm so happy to hear that the general consensus now is that this is a thing, that this is being talked about in the general culture and such. You
Mm.
know, so
It's
so let's talk about similarities, Fern. I think both a sibling and a parent can exhibit narcissistic traits, right? And we've seen this with people in our Facebook community where people get these types of experiences, unfortunately, with some family members, and we hear a whole lot about it. And of course, oftentimes this manifests as conditional love, if at all, right? And demeaning or devaluating behavior, or the sense of even competing with a family member for attention and approval from others.
or looking to a child to gain their own glory, which is a really common aspect of a narcissistic parent.
Yeah. Yeah. Living vicariously through their children, right? I think that's what
Yeah.
happens, especially.
Yeah.
We see this, right?
Right. There isn't a clear boundary between the parent and the child, and they place their own needs and expectations on the child and then hope to get some sort of refracted or reflected glory from it.
Yeah. And it's really dismaying for a child that's going through this to see that their parent is somehow living through them or somehow wanting for them to make the same choices or somehow even being in competition with their own child, right?
You know, it's interesting as you're speaking of this, I'm thinking about what we have been talking about before, which is the need to individuate.
Yeah.
And when you have that kind of narcissistic parent, you don't know where he or she begins and you or ends and you begin. You know, there are very murky boundaries between the two. And as a result, it's very hard to individuate.
Absolutely.
That's when sometimes estrangement comes in because that's like a pull the plug short circuiting on the whole system. That way, I'm going to individuate, may not be healthy or productive, but I'm out of here.
Sometimes it's necessary for that. I think that when estrangement happens, there needs to be that pivotal shift where there's that restructuring within ourselves, right? And that's part of some of the tasks of meaning associated to the grieving of a sibling or parental relationship. I think that's the thing that's especially important, right? Where there's that restructuring, and that translates as individuation, right? Where family can sometimes take a back seat and all of a sudden take up less importance for the sake of our own qualities flourishing, being ourselves fully, being the person we know ourselves and believe ourselves to be, right?
Yeah. And one of the things I've seen in a lot of clients particularly is that they displace their rage towards their parents onto a sibling. And part of the reason for that is that relationship is a little less significant, the sibling relationship, than the parental relationship. And so they're more comfortable being angry at the sibling than the parent.
Yeah, and that's very true. That's very true because there's this idea that you can't really lash out, right, to that parental figure or that symbol of love, right? Because conflicting emotions can be very difficult to navigate through, right? You're supposed to
Mhm.
love your parent, you're supposed to honor your parent, but yet if you don't do that, then what does that say about you, right? So for some
Right.
people, it can mean negating some of their feelings or like you're saying, transferring onto somebody else. And that's the risk involved with that, right? And I think that what that creates, of course, is that creates a sense of neglection, right? Because oftentimes I hear in the community that people feel a sense of being unimportant or that they don't matter, right? And I think that this can also have like a negative impact on our decisions and in how we see ourselves.
Right. It's that core belief that starts to play out in other aspects of your life.
Hmm. Yeah, and this whole idea of family first, right? This whole focus, it can potentially create an unhealthy family system because if you put family first at all costs, that means you're, of course, setting yourself aside, negating how you feel, and perhaps even opening yourself up to situations of toxic behaviors or abuse that can potentially happen within that family system.
Right. And I keep coming back to this idea of how important it is to individuate. And if you don't individuate and you become enmeshed with those parents, you're going to become really anxious because you don't have a sense of self and well-being.
Yeah, that's very important that you develop your own identity, that you find out who you are. And oftentimes I mention to people the importance of being themselves, right? Not somehow pigeonholing themselves into a situation or a family situation where you end up becoming something you're not, or regressing into a role of how you're preconceived and seen as through the family lens. And I think that's so, so important. And at the same time, right? There's this whole idea also of wearing rose-colored glasses, right? You and I have talked about euphoric recall before, and I think this is where people get in that trap of somehow thinking, oh, well, I can do better, or was it really that bad, right? And I often say to people that a few positive moments doesn't take away the years of hurt, manipulation, and failure that was existing on their part because of that.
Right. You have to hold two opposing thoughts in your brain at the same time, which is not necessarily easy to do. There's a huge risk too if you let those patterns continue because if you have this dysfunctional pattern, you run the risk of replicating it in
Yeah.
a marriage or in other friendships, and you'll find yourself re-triggered over and over again because of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's the thing that happens, right? Is that this can start to generate into other areas, right? It can start to grow in your decision making, in your choice of relationships. And that's the thing that happens, right? Often when people don't have a good sense of self-esteem for themselves, how this can start to affect us negatively in other areas, which is why I do, of course, the sibling estrangement workshop precisely for that reason, to help people out to get beyond that.
Right. That enmeshment is carried over until you begin the process of becoming aware of it and mindful to terminate it
Mhm.
and stop those patterns in the next relationship.
Exactly. And I think that's the thing that happens also with enmeshment, like you're saying, is this idea that we somehow can't be ourselves and have our own personalities, right? And I think this is what creates a type of clash that can lead to estrangement. It's this idea that oftentimes some personalities are reactive to others and fail to make room for them for being just who they are. And I think that when this happens, this creates an unhealthy power dynamic that creates aversive feelings, awkwardness, and really leads to defensiveness, especially with either sibling or parental estrangement.
Yeah, it reminds me of what we were talking about in a previous episode where we discussed this idea of attachment versus authenticity.
Yes,
And if you cannot be authentic in your relationships, they're not worth much.
exactly. Exactly. Now, let's talk about differences, right? There's differences also that are, of course, with these two types of estrangement experiences. And I think one of them is the power dynamic that is very different between siblings and parents, right? We rely on our parents for our basic and emotional needs, right? And whereas siblings can play more of a supportive role that can be nourishing if it's a healthy relationship.
Yeah, but that's the big if right there. And when you come from a chaotic or dysfunctional family, which by the way is a risk factor for estrangement, you're likely to repeat that, as we were saying earlier. And that's a real dangerous path.
It can be, and it can really be devastating for a child to simply not have the approval of a parent or the fact that their parent is emotionally available, right? And I think that when a sibling isn't available for us emotionally, it can be frustrating and disappointing, but it doesn't necessarily interrupt us in the same degree that lack of parental involvement would, right?
Right. I personally struggled with a father who didn't speak to me for a long time, and it's devastating. There's really no words. And actually, this happened to me during college, and years later, when I returned to the location of my college, all of those feelings I had of alienation and isolation came back to me, and it was almost hard to breathe just because it had become, during that time when I was so young, a source of great rumination.
Yeah, and what you're describing is a sense of, I think, a sense of liberation that can sometimes happen, right? You find out how it could have been, right? And all of a sudden it can open up the dams. And sometimes that's good in some ways because it allows you to find out who you really are and it allows you to get in touch with your own potential, but it also reminds you of what you didn't have, right? And
Or it
that's,
can make you really desperate, Ollie John, to try to get the approval and love that you didn't get.
yes.
And that can be a real dry well.
Yeah, exactly. And of course, parents can also be emotionally immature, right? And if they put their own needs first and cause their child to question their sense of importance in the family, then that can be very detrimental because again, it could create a sense of self-worth that is less than for that child because of the emotional immaturity or uninvolvement of that parent.
I think this too plays into this concept that if you're raised in all this, you think it's normal. This is all you know. And so, again, that's where the replication occurs. That this is what you know. You meet somebody who treats you the same way. Oh, I'm home. When in fact, it's equally dysfunctional as where you came from.
Yeah, yeah, that can happen too. And also, I've seen in some cases where people do realize that they're different, right? And that their situation or family structure is different. And that can also be very isolating as well. And that's the hard part, right? And especially when you have people that can be very smart. I have some people I've worked with that tend to be extremely insightful, extremely intelligent, and they had that level of emotional maturity that was way, way higher than their parents and they were able to determine that they would probably feel more isolated because of their experience at a very young age, you know.
There are other factors that can play into it too. So oftentimes somebody can be an undiagnosed as a highly functional autistic person. And you may not get what you need from a parent like that, but not recognize that they have this disability. And as a result, you personalize it and replicate it again. So it's really, that's why it's so important to become aware.
Yeah, self-awareness about the family system, about ourselves, who we truly are, is really important. So let's talk about the needs for both of these situations, Fern. I think one of them, of course, and I think we've been looking at this idea, I think, for the better part of this podcast, is the idea of gaining approval and acceptance from others around you, right? And if you
Mhm.
can't have that from a parent, well, you need to look for somebody else that can give that to you as well, right? Be it
Mhm.
friends, acquaintances, or anybody else around you that you feel can play that type of role formally or informally.
Yeah, I know a lot of women, particularly who did not get the love of a mother that they needed, and they find an older person who steps into that role as a second mother,
Mhm.
and they get those needs met. And that's a very productive and functional way to address that limitation that you experienced as a child.
Absolutely, because we all need this sense of warmth and support, right? And we really have to have that as an emotionally corrective experience for us, especially if we built up a negative image of ourselves. We need to have that sense of self-acceptance and approval also, not just from ourselves, but also from a parental figure, be it from our family or beyond. And I also think that what's important is, of course, being seen as a healthy and independent adult and really achieving our sense of individuation, like you were saying, right? The idea of being able to live through to up to our potential, and of course, not allowing ourselves to gaslight or be gaslighted by past events and such from some parents or siblings and such.
Yeah, Dr. Bowen, the psychiatrist and the pioneer and family therapist, has said that you have to separate your own emotions from your parents and siblings. And those who are not differentiated will blame themselves for the ills of the family, such as a parent's divorce or siblings' emotional problems or family feuds. So that's kind of an interesting insight.
Absolutely. And what you're saying is that it's really key for us to recognize that it's not about us or any shortcoming on our part, right? It's really about them. And when we start to do that, then all of a sudden we start to limit the ownership of taking that on, right? Taking on
Mhm.
something that's not ours. So I often say to people in our community that this doesn't belong to us, you know, and I think that's important to break that, right? We want to break the idea that somehow we need to own this situation as though we created this, because clearly we didn't. And this is where the grieving becomes really important, grieving the relationship you never had, combined with, as we were saying earlier, the restructuring of the role of family or siblings and what they play in your life, especially, is key, right?
Well, just imagine how hard this is for the parentified child.
Yes, very much. All right, Fern, we're almost out of time, so let's talk about resources. What would be your number one resource at this time?
Well, I've been doing one-on-one coaching, and that's a wonderful opportunity for others to come into awareness about some of the limitations of their family and how it's playing out in their present day lives. So I would say that that's something that is a resource for others. And of course, I always learn with each session.
Yeah, and that's great. And I think that one of my number one resources at this time is, of course, the longstanding Sibling Estrangement Support Group. There's really nothing else like it out there. This is a place where people can come together, of course, and strengthen themselves, break isolation, and simply feel less alone. Feel as though there's other people that are experiencing the same thing in an
Mhm.
uplifting and empowering atmosphere. It's so,
Mhm.
so important for people to have, especially. And I also offer some therapy sessions for people that, of course, are going through sibling or family estrangement issues. Very, very important that they can reach out if they need to with regards to this. So, yeah. So, Fern, we're just about out of time. So, I really, really am happy that we were able to talk about this, about the similarities, differences, and of course, the needs for both of these types of estrangement, be it sibling or parental and such.
Yeah, and the one thing I'd like to conclude with is a lot of times when you have sibling estrangement, it metastasizes to parental alienation because people take sides. So once the concept of cutoff is introduced into the family, it can spread.
You're absolutely right. And we see this especially in our Facebook community, right? I see this with people that talk about this in the support group as well, how it degenerates into other roles within the family as well, other members and such. And it's important for us to keep on empowering ourselves and becoming more self-aware so that way we can break the cycle. So, Fern, thank you so much for doing this. It's always wonderful to get together and talk. And I very much look forward to our next episode together.
Me too.
All right, you take care.
Bye.
Bye bye.